So you raised a lot of issues, Deepak. So let me just go back a moment to say that most scientists today, scientists and philosophers, view consciousness, how the brain produces consciousness, as a form of computation among neurons. They look at the brain as 100 billion or so simple switches, neurons that either fire or don't fire. They interact, they compute, and when that computation reaches a critical level of complexity, they say consciousness emerges, kind of like pulling a rabbit out of the hat. Now, I don't agree with that, and Roger Penrose and I have developed a theory which says all that computation occurs, but where consciousness comes from, where awareness, what philosophers call qualia, flavors, taste, touch, conscious perceptions, awareness, actually involves reaching down to the basement level of the universe, which is what you would, in the Vedanta, is consciousness, and what we would call
pure consciousness.
Pure consciousness. And we would say that pure consciousness is included in fundamental space-time geometry, along with the precursors of spin, mass, or charge. Everything that we see in our real world, all the beauty we see around us, actually stems from patterns in the most fundamental level that percolate up to our level, which is many, many orders of magnitude higher. So how does that happen? Well, Penrose and I developed this theory that the microtubules inside neurons, that the neurons are already too high a level, but if you go down inside neurons, you see these structures that are sort of like computers. They look like computers, they act like computers, and they may be quantum computers in which the bits or the ones or zeros can actually be in superposition of both 1 and 0. Now, what does that mean? That means if you're in a superposition, or something's in a superposition of being both here and there, it means that the universe itself, at its most basic level, has separated, has bifurcated, so that you have a curvature in this way and a curvature in that way. Now, what happens to that separation? In the multiple worlds theory, each separation branches off to form a whole new universe. But Penrose came up with this idea that these separations are unstable, and after a specific time t will collapse to one or the other, with the choice being...
Because of gravity? Because
of quantum gravity, because of the intrinsic nature of the universe, of space-time geometry, some kind of bounciness or some kind of restorative nature to choose one or the other. But the choices are not random, whether it chooses this curvature or that curvature, whether this reality perceived is chosen versus that, depends on information embedded in this geometry, in this Planck scale geometry, which Penrose calls Platonic values. So good, evil, aesthetic, ethical values can actually be embedded in and programmed into the universe, or are embedded into the universe from the Big Bang, presumably, and those can influence our choices in our conscious perceptions and choices if we're mindful and don't act rashly. The underlying entity that gives rise to consciousness would be what we call proto-consciousness. It's quantum information. It includes multiple coexisting possibilities, and when it reaches this threshold for self-collapse, there's a moment of conscious awareness.
A hap.
A hap, a whitehead occasion of experience, a Buddhist moment, which correlate with science in terms of gamma synchrony, EEG, 40 hertz oscillations. So roughly 40 times a second there's a hap, there's a self-collapse, and a moment of conscious awareness. A happening. And we have a perception. Famously, the monks that the Dalai Lama sent over to University of Wisconsin had 80 to 100 moments of consciousness per clock time, per second. And so their perceived reality would slow down since they're having more conscious moments per time.
So they would see everything in slow motion.
Correct. And great athletes, Michael Jordan said that when he's playing well, the defense is in slow motion. People in a car accident, when they're excited, the car's spinning, the outside world slows down because they're having more conscious moments per time than they would under normal circumstances. So consciousness, I think, is a sequence of discrete events, of moments, which are kind of like these self-collapses arising out of the underlying, what you call pure consciousness, what I would call proto-consciousness. And I make that distinction so that we can have a mechanism, and I think we need to have a mechanism for how the brain works and how the brain produces conscious experience.
Now, this activity which is occurring in the microtubules is, and you said there are maybe 10 to the power of 27 computations per second, right?
Well, yes, and most views of the brain, as I said, 100 billion neurons switching roughly 1,000 times a second with 1,000 synapses, come up with something like 10 to the 15th operations per second. And that's what the goalpost is for artificial intelligence, for the singularity. When they reach that with their computers, they say that we'll have brain equivalents. I don't think that's right, because if you look at each individual neuron, it's incredibly complicated. It's not a single on-off switch. Or if you look at a simple organism like a paramecium that swims around, it finds food, it can learn, it finds a mate, it has sex, it avoids obstacles, avoids predators. I'm not saying it's conscious, but it's intelligent. It uses its microtubules, these structures that are both the skeleton, the bone-like structural support of the cell, but also the cell's onboard computer in real time processing information, telling the cell what to do. And the microtubules, we think, are the quantum computer in all animal cells in living systems, and in particular in the brain, due to specific circumstances, can have this quantum computation which reaches this collapse and has a moment of conscious experience and connects us to this most fundamental level of the universe, which you would call pure consciousness.
Okay, so these quantum computers are basically the size of molecules, or even smaller, right? Or about molecular size, right?
Yeah, they're made up, microtubules are made up of individual proteins. So a protein is a molecule, it's a peanut-shaped protein, and they self-assemble. It's actually quite a miracle. If you have enough of them with the right pH and salt balance and calcium and so forth, they will self-assemble and form girders, which form the structural support of the cell. It's like the Indian rope trick. The guy throws the rope up and then climbs up the rope. Or imagine a building self-assembling from the ground up, brick by brick. Each brick just floating to the right place. That's how microtubules establish the shape and the structure and the functionality of each of our cells. And of course, the genes are the same in each cell, so it's a matter of differentiation to turn one into a nerve cell and one into something else.
So even though we call them quantum computers, I think they are even more fundamental than, say, a nanocomputer, because a nanocomputer is still operating, if there ever was one, which there isn't, but if there ever was a nanocomputer, it's still operating at the level of atoms. We're going way beyond that, right? 25 orders smaller in magnitude than the atom.
Well, a quantum computer, the material housing the quantum computer may be macroscopic size. The whole point is that life and biology and our brains exist right on the edge between the quantum and classical worlds, allowing quantum information coming from this pure consciousness level that you described to have influence in our classical world, to have causal efficacy in the material world.
Okay, so now let's go a little further, because our subject today is going to be immortality.
Right.
This level, this proto-consciousness level, this pure consciousness level that exists at this very fundamental level of space-time geometry, Planck scale,
it is the fundamental level.
It is the fundamental level. This level is immortal, right? Because it's before space and time come into existence.
Well, that depends on whether the universe is immortal. We don't yet know whether the universe is going to continue to expand, stay in steady state, or eventually have a big crunch. And if that happens, whether there'll be another universe on the other side. But as far as
but the potential for the universe has to be immortal. It came into existence from something, right?
Well, nobody knows the answer to that. I think the latest thinking from Penrose and others is that it's a cycle. There was a big crunch, a collapse, which gave rise to this universe, and we're in that, and that'll eventually perhaps crunch again and give rise to another. I don't think anybody knows for sure, but that's the latest theory, that we're in a cycle of big bangs and big crunches.
I read recently that another theory which says instead of the crunch, because of the dark energy, the universe is keeping on expanding, and it at some point it will override all gravity, and instead of a big crunch there'll be a big rip, which is a huge explosion back into nothingness. But the question is, whatever this nothingness is, from it everything came, and to it everything returns. And again, coming back to my tradition, says when we experience samadhi, when we go into this experience where observer, observed, and process become one, you are actually at ground state. And the ground state of the self, of you as an organism, is also the ground state of the universe. How could it not be? Because there's only one ground state. This ground state is immortal, and therefore there's a part of me which connects to that ground state which is immortal, and embedded in this is the potential, or you might say the superposition of memories, desires, imagination, Platonic values that exist in a superposition of possibilities, and that when I die, I probably go into this ground state, which is part of a matrix of perhaps other individuals or beings, and we're all entangled there while maintaining some kind of individuality, at least in as potential, and that this has the possibility of recycling, what spiritual traditions may call reincarnation. Does your model, which is a model that's being talked about, and I think we should mention that your colleague Sir Roger Penrose was also the thesis advisor of Stephen Hawking, so we're talking about scientists such as yourself and Sir Roger Penrose. Are you saying that your model could possibly lend itself to the survival of consciousness after death, or as proto-consciousness, or as some quantum entangled information in space-time geometry, which could then recycle, which would be basically reincarnation?
Well, I would say that. I should say first that Roger, who's well known on his own right for many, many things, wouldn't necessarily agree with what I'm going to say. He tends to shy away from anything in the spiritual or religious realm. So, but based on our theory, I would say yes, it's possible, because, and the context is, for example, in a near-death experience. I'm an anesthesiologist. I work in an operating room. I put people to sleep and wake them up. I've been doing it for 35 years. Now, we have occasionally cardiac arrests and patients are revived. And there have been a number of studies that show that at least 17% of these people report that during the resuscitation, when their heart was stopped and there was no blood flowing to the brain, they report this NDE, or near-death experience, with common features. For example, a white light, being in a tunnel, perhaps visiting with deceased relatives, usually a sense of calm, serenity, and then and in some cases floating above their body, looking down on the resuscitation. So when these studies were done, the BBC did a show called The Day I Died, and they asked the doctors who did it, did the study, how can you explain this? And they said, we don't know, ask Penrose and Hameroff, because they have this crazy theory. And so here's what I said for the BBC, and I'll stand by this, although it's been controversial. Normally, even right now, our consciousness is happening in our brains, in the neurons, presumably in the microtubules, but due to changes in fundamental space-time geometry, because it's between our ears also. It's everywhere. It's happening at this
It's between our ears, but it's also
correct.
Part of the continuum of the whole universe, right?
Right. But normally, generally speaking, I think it's mostly constrained between our ears because of the isolation mechanisms that prevent decoherence. Although certainly it can extend with ESP and telepathy and other things. But when the blood stops flowing and the energy stops being delivered to the tissues, to the neurons, to the microtubules, the quantum information embedded in Planck scale geometry, at this most basic fundamental level in the brain, can kind of leak out or dissipate to the universe at large, but remain as one entity by quantum entanglement. So
part of the matrix.
Part of the matrix, but staying together as a soul, as that person's consciousness, including their memories, and can exist outside the body in the hologram of the universe, non-local, repeating its scale. And then if the patient is revived, can go back inside the brain, and the patient is revived and says, I had this near-death experience, I was floating above my body. Now, if the patient does not survive, unfortunately dies, then it's possible that this quantum entangled information in the universe, in the matrix, can persist indefinitely and perhaps even go back into a zygote or an embryo, in which case we have reincarnation. So I'm not saying that I can prove that or that definitely exists, but given all the history we have and the lore that suggests it's possible, I would say it's scientifically feasible and plausible for that to occur.
What is the explanation for the fact that a person who's no longer having brain activity can see the room, can see the operating room, can hear sounds, can report? What would be the explanation for that?
Well,
the brain is dead.
most scientists would say that consciousness is a high energy process that emerges from the top at a high level of complex processing, which requires energy. However, if consciousness is actually a quantum effect, quantum requires very little, almost no energy. Ambient heat from room temperature can drive it rather than destroy it. So it could be that in patients who are at the end of life or whose heart has stopped and blood stops flowing, that their outward behavior, the non-conscious processes, the axonal firings that require energy to drive it, they cease and the patient appears dead or moribund, but yet the quantum information can stay entangled for a longer time in the brain, and then when it finally, the energy is completely gone, can leak out or dissipate to the universe at large. It's because it's the lowest energy process.
But yet there is seemingly some kind of perception, right? It's an out-of-body perception.
It's the same. Yes, it's consciousness very much like would occur inside our body, except it's
disembodied. Disembodied perception, which would kind of fit in with the whole idea of astral bodies and astral planes and perception in these planes, the lokas of ancient lore.
The universe is a hologram. A hologram, is a three-dimensional image that's projected from two dimensions, and you record it typically in a photographic plate. That's the old-fashioned way of doing it, and all the information for the image in 3D is stored in this plate. And then when you re-illuminate it, you get a three-dimensional image. But if you take the plate and smash it into a million pieces, take one little piece of the plate and re-illuminate it, you don't get one little piece of the image, you get the entire image. All the information is in every little location. It's just a little more blurry or less focused. So it turns out that consciousness and memory in the brain are arranged as a hologram, and even more astounding, the universe is a hologram. We were talking about that discovery recently with gravity waves, looking at gravity waves emanating from the Planck scale, and they found noise in these detectors, which at first they thought were some kind of artifact, but they found that the noise, the same information pattern repeated roughly every 3 orders of magnitude, going up from the Planck scale up to the level of our biology. So the universe is a hologram, and this repeating noise, the scale-free dynamics scaling up, gets to the level of the brain, or to the level of biology. Now, on the other side of the coin...
So let me stop you there, because this is mind-boggling. You and I are having a conversation. We're in this place in New York City, which is part of the planet, and all this is being orchestrated from a two-dimensional surface somewhere on the edge of the universe in a black hole.
Well, not necessarily. I think the idea emanating from a singularity or black hole would be that it came from the Big Bang, perhaps. So I don't know about some other black holes. There are a lot of them.
From the Big Bang.
But the other side of the coin is that neuroscientists, for example, Marcus Rakel has shown that if you look at the brain waves at different frequencies in the brain, you can go from fairly slow, like roughly 10 seconds, which is roughly the order of a given train of thought, down to hundreds of cycles per second, down even to nanoseconds. So it's roughly every 3 orders of magnitude. But so there's a gap between that and what we know coming up from the universe, and that's where the microtubules step in, because they have resonant frequencies in the kilohertz and in the megahertz. The actual microtubules vibrate in the megahertz, and also in the gigahertz, the water inside the microtubule core. So if you go from the brain to the neuron to the microtubules, you connect it to the universe, and we're several steps on this hierarchical level from the Planck scale on up. So when you meditate, and if you reach an altered state, you might go from having, say, 40 or 80 cycles thoughts per second, skipping to, say, 8,000 or to 800,000 or millions, and every 3 orders of magnitude. And as you go down in scale, you increase frequency, you increase the intensity, you increase the vastness and the vividness of the information. So that could be your lokas in Vedanta, your astral planes even, that can exist at these smaller levels scale-wise, but vaster levels in terms of information processing.
Well, the word loka in Sanskrit is related to the English word location.
Right.
So location in space-time, as a projection of this space-time geometry depending on the frequency domain in which it is manifesting. So, there's a great story in the Vedanta of Ram, the incarnation of God. Okay, and he's born into a royal family, and his father sends him to the great sage, the rishi, whose name is Vasishtha. And as is the custom in India, the king, the incarnation of God, bows down and touches the feet of this great sage. And the sage says, "Hey, stop it. What are you doing that for? You're God." And Ram says, "I might be God, but I've forgotten. So can you please tell me how to remember who I am?" And so the lessons begin. And the first lesson, or one of the first lessons, is there are infinite universes, infinite worlds. They come and go in the vast expanse of consciousness. They're like motes of dust dancing in a beam of light, shining through that hole in my roof. And then he starts to explain that these lokas, or these locations, are actually projections of this fundamental proto-consciousness, what you call proto-consciousness, what we call pure consciousness, and that there are actually an infinity of them, because the superposition of possibilities is infinite, literally, and therefore I'm now going to teach you how to travel in these different domains of consciousness, and that is the body of the work called Yoga Vasishtha. We actually, at our place, we teach a course called Secrets of Enlightenment, where we actually use some of these techniques to give people at least some experience, and without drugs, without anything, into experiencing these more unmanifest domains of this consciousness. So this world that we're experiencing now is the gross world, or you might say the manifest order of space-time causality in its most in its most solid form, material state. But prior to this and deeper to this, there are more expanded levels of manifestation. They're relatively less material. So we have a gross body, a subtle body, and then what they call the causal body, from where all this is happening, which would be the proto-consciousness.
Yeah, you mentioned that there were 7 lokas supposedly, and I think if you go every 3 orders of magnitude, be about seven stages between our biological scale and getting down to near the Planck scale. So we should investigate that further.
But let's talk a little bit about the heart problem, and I want to actually see if we can give people an understanding of it. So here I'm holding something, and we say this is a pink, it's a rose, I think.
I think so.
Pink rose, and this is green, and all these beautiful colors and this lovely arrangement. What's coming from here to my eyes, the photons that are coming from here to my eyes, have no pink in them.
Everything but pink. It's
everything but pink.
Right.
Okay, and everything but green. But even so, they are at a fundamental level. We're talking about frequencies of electromagnetic waves that are colorless, right? Otherwise, we'd see something here. But there's some colorless electromagnetic frequency coming to my eyes, which is causing, through a series of processes, an electrical current to go to my brain, where there are synaptic firings. So there's no green from here to there, and yet I'm experiencing green, which we call a qualia, right? A subjective experience of green. Where is that green?
Well, that depends on whom you ask. Most neuroscientists would say that just as you said, it's kind of an illusion created in the brain. What I would say is that the essential, let's take the pinkness of the rose. The essence of that, pinkness, the smell, are a particular configuration of Planck scale geometry at the universe, spreading out over the space that the rose is occupying. And those particular patterns are reproduced in our brain, because the quantum information from the rose entering our eyes, it's not only the photons that register in the back of the retina and the wavelength is determined. or the the intensity is determined, but also there's quantum information going between the inner and outer segments of the rods and cones through the ciliary stalk that can extract quantum information more than what's visible even, and that can be reproduced in our brain so that we are capturing the fundamental essence of the rose by reproducing the Planck scale geometry configurations of the rose in our brains.
So every time I look at the rose, I'm recreating it?
I think it's likely that the redness and the essence, the essential features of the rose, the qualia of the rose, are being recreated in your brain or being transmitted to your brain. I mean, there's really the idea that there's a separation is an illusion of the material world, and in the quantum world, there's actually a connection. But sticking to the material explanation, yeah, you could say it's being recreated in your brain, the essential qualities, the qualia of the rose, due to the space-time geometry configurations are being reproduced in your brain.
So you remind me of a poem by Rumi. He says, "Let the waters settle, and you will see stars and moon mirrored in your being."
Yeah.
We are co-creating this rose with whatever exists at that fundamental level.
I think so. I think the essence of it is happening in here. And
so this is frequently referred to as the hard problem, right?
Right.
Explain the hard problem.
Well, the hard problem refers to the question of why we have experience, why we have qualia, why we have redness, pain, joy, sorrow. It could have been that the world could be populated by entities that look and act like us, that have complex behavior, but have no inner life, have no inner awareness.
Zombies.
Zombies, they're called. Philosophers came up with a term called zombies, which would be somebody who looked or acted like us, but had no inner experience. It could be
couldn't fall in love.
Couldn't fall in love. They could, pretend to fall in love to mimic behavior. But in the movies, androids, robots, the kid in AI who supposedly didn't have any actual inner feelings or consciousness. These would be zombies. So the question is, are zombies possible? Is there something that is missing, that could be missing from our brain, in which we would still behave and outwardly look like we're conscious but not have it? And David Chalmers, the philosopher David Chalmers, Australian philosopher, coined the term the hard problem. He said, look, there's all these problems of memory, of reportability, of perception, of behavior, of learning, and so forth, which can be non-conscious. Now, sometimes they're conscious, but they can occur non-consciously. These are very, very difficult questions, and laboratories around the world are spending eons of time and money trying to solve them, but they're easy compared to the question of why we have qualia, why we have experience, what distinguishes us from a creature or an android or a robot that may behave in a complex manner but doesn't have any inner experience. So that's the hard problem. And I look at it this way: consciousness, the hard problem depends on the quantum aspects that we've discussed, but the other aspects of the brain can go on without it. And for example, when I put someone to sleep in anesthesiology, in anesthesia for surgery, let's say for spine surgery, let's say we're going to have to operate on somebody's cervical spine, we have the neurophysiologists come in and they put electrodes and record from the brain signals from the feet and the arms to make sure that the signals are getting through to the brain, that the spine's intact, the spinal cord is intact during the surgery. And yet the patient's unconscious. The patient has no consciousness whatsoever, but we're recording evoked potentials from the brain. We're recording signals from the periphery going through the spinal cord to the brain, and the brain is working perfectly well. It's kind of like that's an easy problem. It's not that easy, and people who work in this area get insulted when then they hear it's easy, because it's not. But compared to why there's awareness, why there's experience at all, they are the easy problems, and the hard problem is why we have qualia, why we have a sense of awareness of conscious experience.
And as far as science is concerned, so far, there's not even a theory to explain this qualia, is there?
No, a lot of people kind of trivialize the question. They say, well, it emerges at a higher order of complexity, just like wetness emerges from water, or various higher order properties emerge. But that's just a guess, and there's no evidence for that. There's no testable predictions for that. Our approach, this part of it is hard to come up with testable predictions, but our solution to the hard problem is to say that it connects to the fundamental level of the universe, which gets into your territory of pure consciousness.
So people like Richard Dawkins, who I had a run-in with, people like Michael Shermer, who heads a Society for Skeptics, who had to debate at Caltech. listening to me, they've frequently said you misuse science to propagate your theories. And now that I'm having a conversation with a professor, a scientist, an anesthesiologist who puts people to sleep and
wakes
them up afterwards, what would you say to these guys who say you're full of it?
They're full of it, and
no, they're saying you're full of it.
Well, they're full of it. That's what I'm saying, because their solution to the hard problem is to ignore it, or to say, well, it emerges at a higher order complexity. Don't bother me with the details; that'll come along. Or to pretend it doesn't exist. Daniel Dennett wrote a book, Consciousness Explained, where he just kind of explained away the problem. So their approach is to look at the brain as a computer and pretend the problem of consciousness that we're discussing doesn't exist whatsoever.
So they would think of themselves as zombies?
No, they would. Well, you'd have to ask them, but they would say that there's not really they would question whether a zombie is possible. They would say if you have the machinery to do what the brain does, then you have consciousness along with it, and that could be true that is true if you include the quantum properties. But they're cutting it off at the level, not only at the level of classical versus quantum, but at the level of neurons versus going inside neurons. So I think they're missing the boat entirely, and there's so many questions they couldn't answer, but they won't debate me. They've criticized me, and I've challenged them to debate me, and they always chicken out.
So is the universe conscious?
I would say it's proto-conscious. It's kind of dreaming. It has this pure consciousness perhaps built into it, but without the snapshots of awareness. That only happens when this particular type of self-collapse or objective reduction.
So something is dreaming up the universe.
Well, you could say that. Or
could we call it God?
I wouldn't have a problem with that. I think, when you talk about God and spirituality, I think of three things. There's interconnectedness among living beings, which you can explain through quantum entanglement. There's the ability to access and be influenced by cosmic wisdom, if you will, divine guidance or following the way of the Tao. And, Penrose put these Platonic values, or proposed that these Platonic values, including mathematical truth, aesthetic, and ethical values, are built into the universe, the Planck scale, as patterns. And our conscious thoughts are influenced by these Platonic values. So it's conceivable that we have influence by this cosmic wisdom, if you will. And the third thing would be, afterlife that we've talked about, that the possibility that consciousness can exist after the body dies, at least temporarily, and perhaps be recycled in reincarnation.
So there's cosmic wisdom, there's cosmic immortality, and there's cosmic truth, goodness, harmony, and evolution, and that's God.
Well, we hope so.
Okay.